either the end of growth comes by disaster or by design. And I would argue for the design option because it's a lot better for human and ecological well-being.
Welcome to the Sarah Tajima podcast, where we discuss conscious design for humanity and the planet. Today, my guest is Gaya Herrington, a sustainability researcher and well-being economist located in Washington, D.C. Gaya is a regular guest lecturer, keynote, and TED speaker. She's been shaping conversations at the local and global level with her message that true sustainability will not be achieved without transforming our economic system away from an obsession with perpetual growth to one that centers around human and economic well-being. Gaya has a master's in econometrics from the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and she also has a master's in sustainability from Harvard. She's currently working as the vice president of sustainability at Schneider Electric. Schneider Electric was voted the most sustainable corporation in the world by Time magazine in 2024. Please enjoy this conversation with Gaya. Well, Gaya, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you on, especially after I discovered your research as I was writing about growth. So to get started, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah. So right now I'm a sustainability researcher and increasingly called a well-being economist, and which makes sense. I have a background in econometrics. So I actually started out in finance. I was born in the Netherlands. So I started out in finance, then the Dutch Central Bank I worked at. And then once I came to the US in 2014, I went back to school and I did another master's in sustainability at Harvard. And my thesis I turned into a journal article about the limits to growth. And in that I did an update to the first system dynamics model of the world that was created by MIT in the 1970s. So over a half a century old model. And a system dynamics is where it's very different than the econometrics that I was taught. In those kind of models, everything is interconnected. There are no exogenous variables. So there are no what you have in mainstream economics externalities. Those are just unintended consequences that you maybe don't want to think of now. And so you have and with those kind of models, you can see things like exponential increases or collapses or, very non-linear behavior that are hard to model in classic economic models. And I thought, I think that's a much better way to model certain kind of things like society or our economy. And so they made that for the global society and like variables with like population, food production, industrial production, etc. And they ran scenarios with that. And the business as usual scenario in there was based on historical averages only. So no additional assumptions. And that at the time got a great stir in the public opinion because it showed that welfare and other things that we care about would increase to a certain point in the 21st century and then steeply decline, which they called a collapse. So it was a bestseller at the time, but most people have never heard of it because it was very effectively buried because of this warning message. So a couple of years ago for my thesis, I was like, well, we have a few decades worth of data. So I did an empirical data update. And what did I find? We are actually quite closely aligned to that business as usual scenario, which shows the peak of the collapse being around now, followed by a steep decline, including in our well-being levels. So based on that research, which then went viral, I concluded that we really live in a now or never moment in time because we're still at the peak. The descent has not started to really set in yet. And so we really live in a now or never moment in time to change the course of history. What we do in the next few years, we're talking about 5 years here, like the next few years, they will determine our well-being levels for the rest of this century.
Yeah, it's crazy. When I saw the different models that you had shown, I think it was business as usual, and what were the two others?
Those are very informative too. Yeah, you can create all kinds of scenarios, right? But I picked these four. So it's business as usual. Yeah. There was a comprehensive technology one in there. That is to address this, what you hear very often, that people say, no, technology will save us. Basically, that story, right?
The techno-optimism.
Yes, so I'm sure we'll get into that. Then there was the other one that was called stabilized world, because in the 1970s, sustainability wasn't that much of a turn. But that's basically the sustainable world. So what happens there? There's no collapse in the sustainable world. or the stabilized world in that scenario. But that scenario does have additional assumptions. And the core assumption there is that the goal, the ultimate goal of the economy is changed. So we change societal priorities and values. Right now, our economic system is ultimately its goal is growth. And so that's why the book was called The Limits to Growth, because they say there are limits to that. And that ultimate pursuit will lead us bumping into planetary boundaries. And at some point, what goes up must come down. And so in the stabilized world scenario, the goal is changed from growth towards meeting human needs within planetary boundaries. And then you see that actually well-being levels are stabilized at the peak. And they don't increase forever. A continuous increase happens nowhere because it's not possible. So there's no scenario where we keep growing. But there are scenarios where we maintain what we have.
So you said that we're on the business as usual path. So is there a chance for us to get to that stabilized scenario?
Yeah, so that is the question, right? Can we get to that? So the answer is yes, but not within this current system. So we cannot get to that with just doing less damage, right? So that's the promise of technology, increased efficiencies, green consumption kind of story. It is not nearly enough. And there's plenty of data. You don't need this model at this point for that. There's much better data out there that shows that our ecological footprint, right? Wackernagel has done our global footprint. That's been above Earth's carrying capacity since the 70s as well. Mm-hmm. We know Johan Rockström's work on planetary boundaries, where we've already transgressed 6 of the 9. He recently did a TED Talk. I think it was actually only came on last week. So it only came on, I think, in mid-August. And where he says scientists are worried because it's the same story. We're running out of time. We have a few years left. And after that, there's no stopping it. So it's very interesting how that lines up with this prediction or the forecast, I should say, in the 70s already. They said we have to act now, otherwise we're going to reach tipping points and there will be no stopping it. So we know that, and then what has to happen. So basically, ultimately, what it comes down to is, if it was going to happen with this economic system, it would have happened by now. Right. So it's not going to happen within that, but we can change our economic system. We haven't always had this growth pursuit. You and I have grown up in it. So we're like, wait, can it be different? Yes. In fact, it has been different for most of human history. And we have to consciously change it to get to that stabilized world scenario.
Yeah, I really like that message. So for some of our listeners who are not familiar, can you help connect the dots between growth and fossil fuels and why we are at where we are now?
Right. Yeah, and fossil fuels, of course, have been a critical component of that. The energy part is a huge part of it. And and that's also linked to climate change, of course, but climate change is only one of the sustainability challenges that we see, right? It's like carbon dioxide in the air is one of the planetary boundaries, and there are 9 more.
Yes. That actually really surprised me when I first heard of planetary boundaries as I was doing the research for my newsletter and this podcast, that climate change is just one segment, as you said, out of 9. And there's so many others like biodiversity that people don't even consider.
Absolutely. Water and a lot of social damaging, unsustainable trends. I think this growing income and wealth inequality that we see in many parts of the world and between countries is also part of that. And it is unsustainable. Because when you create a society where a majority of the people are struggling and a good chunk of it has absolutely nothing left to lose, including their health, that's not a sustainable situation either. I think that's a very common misconception to conflate climate change with overall sustainability. And that goes really well towards an often overlooked part in the limits to growth as well, which is the S, limits, plural. What you see a lot of the time, for example, when people are only focusing on carbon emissions, they're like, hey, we've reduced our carbon emissions by 20%, which, by the way, still means you have 80% of them. Okay, that's the majority. So it's still often not sustainable. But apart from that part, that it's not enough. The reduction in and of itself is good. But what you see is that it typically comes with impacts in other areas than carbon emissions that increase that get worse. For example, it's more technology intensive, so it uses more water for the production and the mining of those metals. There are more adverse human rights impacts in those countries where those metals are mined. All those kind of things. There a lot of mining causes biodiversity loss, you know? So, and that's typically what you see. An often heard criticism of the limits to growth back then, and what I got too, is like, but humans, there are no limits to growth because there are no limits to human innovation. And that's just simply not true. We are very innovative. We are a very innovative species. But what you often see is that an innovation, we can innovate ourselves out of some constraints, and then you just bump into another constraint, because ultimately we're still on a finite Earth. And
Right.
even if that were the case, which it definitely is, we also have a finite amount of time. So the time it takes to get to an innovation and then scale it and make it really workable, that typically
Yeah.
takes around a decade. It's not that we think of something and then, oh, the solutions are there. So
Right.
ultimately, time is our biggest constraint as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on something that really made me think of this. Have you seen the carbon tunnel vision
Yes,
image?
yes.
So that's what that makes me think of, is only focusing on carbon. But one thing I wanted to ask you is, like, how do you define sustainability? Because I think so many people have a very narrow view of what sustainability is.
Yes, yes. And I think we've developed a lot there. I think, purely literally spoken, it's something that can last, right?
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
why you got to the UN, the Brundtland's Commission's definition of, meeting our needs now without impeding on the needs of future generations.
Hmm.
What you do see now in sustainability in general is that there's much more of a focus of giving back more than you take, because
Hmm.
that's kind of the thing. If you talk about sustainability in that narrow definition, we're not taking
Yeah.
away from the future generations. Your impact
Yeah.
is zero. Is that really what we want to do? No harm. No, we want to leave the world better than we found it. In fact,
Yeah.
that's one of our basic motivations, I would say. Yes,
Hmm.
first, our most basic motivations are shelter, water, food. Absolutely. Safety, yes.
Yeah.
But once we have that covered, you see that we're very much motivated not by ever more stuff, but by
Hmm.
having a sense that we contribute to other people's well-being, or to nature, ecological
Yeah.
well-being. So that thing is actually very deeply in us, and that's why I think this net zero also doesn't really work, because it's just not that motivating, and it's very
Yeah.
based on, it's very calculating. There are a lot of other concerns, like who decides what gets calculated and how it is
Hmm.
calculated. That part aside, I also don't think it's what really resonates with us,
Yeah,
right?
I think you're right. I think there's a strong social desire right now for something more, and people are not, this kind of traditional company where it is very extractive is not resonating with people anymore. And we do see more, circular design, circular economy, regenerative stuff. So I think we're slowly shifting in this direction.
I agree. You see such a thirst in young people whose basic needs are met, and then they're like, "Do I really want to like slave for decades of my life for ever more stuff?" And you just see that it's not that motivating to them, and that's very normal. That's human, because we are, and that's the kind of story we tell about ourselves ultimately that underlies this economic systems change. Is who are we, who do we want to be, and what world do we want to live in. So it goes back to some very basic things.
When you decided to focus on this issue in particular, why did you choose that topic for your research?
It was simply just because I read it and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that's a good way to model things. And especially because I know a thing or two about models. And I was like, oh, this one could be very useful for certain situations. Because it's been quite obvious to economists that these old mainstream models don't work that well in a lot of situations. And so I was like, oh, this could actually be something different. And I just looked for whoever had made the update. And then I noticed that there was one person, but that was many years ago. And I was like, why is no one looked into this? And I think
Yeah.
that's why I did it. I think the
Okay.
reason no one else had done it is because it was very effectively buried. And I
Mm,
think that's
very interesting.
yes. So and that really goes to power structures in society that
Yeah,
are so important, and then again are also completely ignored by mainstream economics. Right? They
right.
ignore
Yeah,
institutional factors, power imbalances. They're just like, well, we're all optimizing here our own best interests, and that works out perfectly well, unless you're doing it wrong. So I guess you're just not that rational.
yeah.
But there are a lot, if you're not successful, that's often like poverty is often blamed on the people in poverty, etc.
Mhm.
And it just completely ignores all the institutional and systemic issues at play, I think.
Yeah, I had an expert on systems thinking on the podcast just like a week ago, and we were also talking about a very similar topic about the power structures at play and how these are like not often thought of in the design process.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's so important to do that. And if you talk
Mhm.
about design, that's really, we design our own economy. Okay, the
Yeah.
economy is a social construct, and I think one of the reasons that we have this Homo economicus, the reason that economists love that so much, is because otherwise all those impressive looking formulas don't work at all. So the theories just don't really work, but they're so impressive. It gave economics the image of a natural science, right? And then you can't argue with it. You can't argue with gravity. I mean, so they're right. If you have this allure of a natural science, you you shut down conversations. While really it is a political discussion. Economics is a social science. We construct it, we design it, and we have to redesign it now.
And I think so many people focus more on the measurements that are coming out from that process instead of the premise itself. Like,
Exactly.
what is the actual premise? So when we're talking about like fossil fuels, for example, they correlate with GDP. Well, I think the point that you're making here is to focus more on well-being as a measurement instead of something like GDP, for example.
Absolutely. So we need new measurements. This is undeniable. But we won't get there just with new measurements. So you're absolutely
Yeah.
right that GDP is obviously a bad measurement. That's the person who came up with it agreed with that too, by the way.
Oh,
Kuznets,
really?
yes, he came up with it, and he was like, "Listen, this is not a good indicator for well-being. Okay, we shouldn't use it for that." And then the
And then we
world,
just ran with
you
it.
would just ran with it, yeah. Anyway, so that's such a sad thing because he's had this happen to him before. There's also this Kuznets curve that shows
Yeah, I've
like,
seen that.
yeah, well, in the beginning when you develop economically, income and wealth inequality goes up, but then it goes down by itself. And Kuznets did say that. He said it looks like that's in the data. I'm not sure, we'd have to test further. And then people just ran with it, and then indeed it wasn't really there. It's not there. It's not there. The reason that it went down is just because of policy, and you should have that policy right from the get-go. It's the same for environments. A lot of people think there's this trade-off between social benefits and environmental benefits. So we have to sacrifice a little bit of nature now, and then after that it can come down. That's not there either. It has to be right from the get-go.
So when in your research you're talking about this like drop that happens, I believe in a decade. If I recall correctly, it's like resources, food, that sort of thing. What exactly is going to happen during that steep drop if we don't do something?
Right. The truth is, of course, nobody knows, right? I don't know the future, but what it seems like, and by the way, what other Earth scientists, people much more expert on this, are warning us about constantly, is that what happens is that the Earth systems that underpin life on Earth as we know it, I know that sounds dramatic, but that's really what it is, are starting to fail. We already see this now, by the way. What you see in a system is once it's the warning signals are the flickering. It's still there because the system has a very strong self-healing capacity, just like our bodies. Our bodies are systems too. And so this huge Earth body, planetary body, it's starting to flicker already. That's what you're seeing right now. And then it establishes the status quo again. But at some point, it will stop being able to do that. And what you then see is a complete breakdown of basic functions that we never think of, but need to survive.
Yeah. And I mean, in a good way and a bad way, we're already seeing this play out with a lot of the climate disasters that are happening and like fires, for example, the ocean, level increasing where I'm from is an island. So you can actually see that they had to
Yes.
move some of the roads inland because it's disappearing with the
Yes,
ocean. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, so you're already seeing it now, but
Yeah.
it's nothing compared to
Yeah.
what will come. And
Right.
what's very important there is to realize that if we don't heed this warning, even if once it starts to become really bad, we're like, oh, we really have to do something now, it might be too
And it's
late.
too
So
late.
that's the
Yeah.
climate tipping points that people like Johan Rockström are warning about.
Yeah. And well, it's crazy that we've already passed 6. And I believe just a few years before it was 4 or something, right? So we passed them quite quickly now.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
This is, and again, it's non-linear, right? Going back to what I said about the models, complex systems like this, it's non-linear. So it starts to increase very, very slowly at first. You're like, we will still have time, but then at some point, exponential growth, and it all comes much quicker than you expected.
Yeah. The Craft interrupts this program to bring you this very important announcement on sustainable growth design. So, for those of you that don't know, I have a course on sustainable growth design. You can take it self serve remotely at your own pace on the Crafts website, or you can take it with me live. And our first cohort that I did in September actually sold out on Maven. So, I've decided to do a second cohort, which is super exciting. It's been amazing to receive all the feedback, all the positive feedback from people. And I wanted to read you 2 messages. So the public reviews are available on Maven, but I also get these private messages that people send me after the course. So this one says, Sarah, thank you so much for this course. It was hugely valuable. You are a shining light in the industry. Thank you. And the second message that I'll share with you is, as I mentioned on LinkedIn, I was over the moon after the class yesterday, and that excitement still holds true today. From the beginning of my career, my main goal has always been to have a positive impact on society. Sometimes we get so focused on creating this feature or that user flow that we forget to step back and view the bigger picture. This course reminded me of the meaningful work we do, and as you mentioned, the privilege we have as designers. So, if this sounds interesting to you, I'm teaching you sustainable growth hacking or responsible growth hacking. You can check it out on maven.com. The course will be October 15th through 17th for 2 hours each day. I'll put the link in the description. You should be able to sign up as long as there are still seats available. So, if you're interested, then make sure you go grab your seat right now. So, can you tell us a little bit about your proposal to focus on the well-being economy instead of this growth goal?
Right. The reason I came up with it is because we're already pretending that's what we have, right? So if I say we have to let go of growth as the ultimate pursuit, we're not anti-growth. I'm just saying as an ultimate goal, it's not that smart, is it? And then the next question is, well, what should it be replaced by? And that is actually quite obvious if you think about it, because it's what we are pretending we're already doing. Why do we say we need growth? To improve people's lives. Well, why don't we just do it directly then instead of indirectly and then fingers crossed hoping that this growth thing worked out? Because as we see in many countries, I'm not talking about the poorest countries. There's a strong correlation between growth and improved human well-being there. But if we've been pursuing growth for decades now, shouldn't at least in the richer countries poverty have been eliminated by now? It's not, it doesn't work that great, does it? I live in the US now. The poverty rates are the amount of people I've seen here, like pregnant women on the streets. I mean, and this is the capitalist headquarters of the world. Like, if it hasn't worked, this growth pursuit in the richest country in the history of the world, it's just not a great solution. So why don't we just do it directly then? So that's what the goal of the economy should be. We design it to meet by default ecological human needs within planetary boundaries. Or another way to say that is to strive for human and ecological thriving.
Got it. So, if I'm understanding correctly, when you talk about growth, you're tying it to GDP.
That is typically how it's measured. But thank you for bringing that up, because we talked about measurements and then we got derailed because there's so much to untie here. And we should get new measurements, but even those can never grow. So it really
Right.
is growth in general, in anything. Because anything you can think of, right? Happiness, knowledge, very lofty goals. But if you make the ultimate goal growth in that, you're gonna get weird things too. You're going to have surveys that ask how happy you are. And then, it's going to get doctored so that people keep increasingly being happy. At some point, you're just going to feed them drugs because our bodies are not capable of being on a 10 all the time, right? So growth in anything, even the most the best goals is just not possible. It's not desirable. But apart from that, yes, a first step would also be to change the measurements.
Yeah, that's such a great point, though, because one of my thoughts was, well, couldn't you just define well-being as a type of growth? We're growing into well-being, or we're growing our degree or the measurement of well-being for the economy.
Yeah, and that's totally, I had that too. I had that too at the beginning. I was like, we have to change it. And then I looked into it further as a researcher and I was like, oh, that wouldn't work either. We really have to let go of growth. And it's not going to be just replacing GDP. But you're also
Yeah.
right that GDP should just, like, it's not a good measurement.
It's super interesting, though, the point that you bring up, because it's true that humans are also not meant to be a 10 out of 10 on well-being all the time. Like, you wouldn't even know that you're a 10 unless you had the twos. You know what I mean? So
Exactly.
it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's that balance.
Yes, and really, unless our needs are unmet, our bodily, physical needs are unmet,
Yeah.
we our biochemistry is really most of the time for most people, it aims
Hmm.
to it balances around a 7. That's just what we do, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's fine. That's fine. But having
Yeah.
said that, I will say that based on where we are currently, I think for countries like the US, if we were to move to a well-being economy, I do think that
Mhm.
overall well-being levels or reported happiness would improve.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because I know there's the Stockholm School of Economics, which is quite a well-known university that has a department that's actually studying this. And I wonder, how do you measure something that seems qualitative?
Oh yeah, good question. That's what we do. Everything is qualitative. I love it when people say like, "Yeah, but isn't that hard to measure?" I'm like, do you think the economy is easy to measure? It's not. Like we just discussed that GDP. Yeah, even the most mainstream economists will say, "Yeah, GDP is not a great measure of the economy." So yes, of course it's qualitative because the world is not made up of numbers, and that's very important to keep in the back of your mind. But yes, well, measuring well-being is absolutely not harder than measuring the economy. That's not the issue at all. We have very, like you said, there are absolutely universities around the world that are studying well-being, happiness, and they all come back with pretty universal things like, oh, guess what? Needs are universal. This is great news, eh? This because that means we can design policies for them. Another great news about needs is that they can be met. We don't need an endless amount of stuff to satisfy them. So that's another thing. What I think, because we still have this growth pursuit and businesses have this profit growth drive, they, I would say, very purposefully blend the line between our needs and our wants. And wants are actually very different. Wants are endless. You can spur them endlessly. And that's often what happens in marketing.
Yeah, it's so good that you bring that up because I think I'm reading this great book right now, actually. It's called Design After Capitalism by Matthew Wazinski. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it talks about this, how designers are complicit in once we reach like the 90s, at least in the global north, let's say, most people have their needs met. So then companies created artificial desires and wants that designers are responsible for selling to people and getting them to want more stuff, more stuff, more stuff.
Yeah, and
So,
that's
yeah.
that's also exactly, and that's a very good segue to what I often say is like, listen, this shift, this letting go of growth, it's not even a sacrifice, and not even to people in richer countries, because we're
Yeah.
constantly these days being told that we're not good enough, right? Not sexy enough, not smart enough, not accomplished enough,
Yes.
not rich enough. And that's because they have to keep you dissatisfied to keep buying
Right.
all this stuff, these fixes
Right.
that supposedly are going to now make you happy with yourself. So
Yeah.
it's very easy to see why shifting to a well-being economy would work for poorer countries. But it's what I think was sometimes less understood is that people who are in richer countries, and that would definitely have to do with less stuff. I want to be clear about that. We would have
Mhm.
less materials in a well-being economy, but we would be so much richer emotionally
Mhm.
and spiritually.
Yeah, so I watched your TED Talk, which was great, by the way. And at the end, I noticed that you mentioned like that this could be a spiritual view. So what do you think makes it spiritual?
It's well, first of all, it's the recognition that we are spiritual, which again
Yeah.
our current society doesn't recognize as much. It's because it's so
Hmm.
steeped in this neoclassical economics thinking of, we're
Hmm.
optimizing everything, and we're not at all like that. So we are selfish maximizers, I would say, when our basic needs are not met. But once those needs are met, we are much more curious and playful and altruistic than this Homo economicus could ever be. And we hurt. We're there's mental anguish when we feel that what we do on a daily basis are just tricks for money to buy stuff. Lot of people, most people, the majority of people in Western countries feel disengaged at work because they're like, what I do adds nothing to society, and that's spiritual suffering.
Yeah, I recently did interviews with designers because I have this new sustainable growth design course that I'm doing on Maven. So he was telling me why he switched into design, and he was in sales before, and he felt like he was taking advantage of people by trying to sell them useless things essentially, and always trying to increase. Well, yes, they could take the basic level one product, but we try to sell them level four because it's more money, you know? So it's like this type of thinking, and he really didn't resonate with it, and he decided to leave.
Of course. While sales in a well-being economy could be a lot of fun, that could actually be a great job for people who are social. So not me necessarily, but the people who like getting to know new people and like, hey, what do you need? What do I have for you? And actually help them satisfy their needs better. I think a lot of people would love that. And that's what a sales would be. A sales job would be in a well-being economy.
So I love this idea that businesses should only exist if they're providing value to society. And if they're not actually providing real value and they're only extracting, then probably they shouldn't exist. But how do businesses then manage, probably for, the people in that business? Okay, yeah, my entire life I've been taught to prioritize growth, and this is what our stakeholders expect. How do they manage that shift? Because it's also a mindset shift.
Yeah, and to some extent, you should pick your stakeholders wisely, right? Who are the
Yeah.
stakeholders that demand it? Are those your
Yeah.
investors? Well, they're a whole that it's a big field of different kind of
Yeah.
investors. So you should pick your investors wisely. Unilever did that, for example. At some point, they were like, "Listen, we're not going to give you quarterly results anymore because it just spurs this short-term thinking that is not
Yeah.
aligned with our values." And so some investors left, and they got new investors. Yeah.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, I really like that
yeah,
that
and so
approach.
that's I think what underlies this, that you pick your stakeholders wisely. There was an EU study that showed that the majority of companies, and we're talking 90%, are quite happy to operate in their steady state. Okay, so this idea that you have to grow is just not true. You can be, and I think a lot of companies are, it's a minority of companies, but it's a significant minority that are already some legal form of a not-for-profit. So that means they're not a charity, they're not a non-profit. They generate revenue and they generate profit, but they make it strictly subordinate to their social and environmental purpose. And I think that's a key difference. So, because we all know this PPP, people, planet, profit. What happens when you have to? So they're all on parity, right? And then what happens if you have to choose between people, a planet, or profit? Who wins? We know the answer, right? It's always profit. So that's why that doesn't work. It doesn't work. So it has to be strictly subordinate to the other two P's. And there are a lot of companies that are doing that, about 20% of a typical economy in the West. So it's totally possible. They pay out all the income, they pay out all the salaries, they provide stable salaries for all their workers, they give useful services and products, and they get a profit for that, as rightly they should, because they add real value. But then it doesn't get accumulated into some rich owner's hands. That's the difference,
Yeah.
typically.
And that's, yeah, typically what happens.
Ownership makes a lot of difference. Yeah.
So I think what I'm observing right now with certain companies' sustainability reports is that they do still think of growth as the goal. So they're saying, well, it's really hard to decouple growth from carbon emissions, for example. Like I think PepsiCo released a report that said something along those lines. And, most companies are struggling with this goal, this pursuit of growth and decoupling from carbon emissions. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. The entire world is struggling with that because it's not there. Decoupling is a myth. This
Yeah.
is, again, it's like, it would be great if it's possible. I agree. Because it's a lot of work to change an entire economic system. It's just not in the data. It is
Hmm.
absolutely a mirage. So there is a little bit of decoupling in like a handful of countries we're talking about. And the
Yeah.
Netherlands
Yeah, I
is
saw
one
that.
where they're like, ooh, there's absolute decoupling. Because that
Right.
is the first of all, so there's what decoupling are we talking about? So there's relative decoupling, which means your
Hmm.
carbon emissions are still increasing, just not as fast as your GDP. But
Yeah.
like that's okay. So this collapse will be postponed by a few years at that point, right? So what you
Hmm.
need is absolute decoupling. So your greenhouse
Yeah.
gas emissions go down while your GDP goes up. This is because people who argue for decoupling don't want to let go of growth, right? Because the best way is obviously to just not grow. But just if they say, well, we have the technological, we're innovative, we have technology, and we're already decoupling, and then you look at what they mean with that, and there is, so the total greenhouse gas emissions are still going up. So at a global level where climate change is happening, by the way, it's not there. There's no absolute decoupling. But even in just that handful of countries that have shown a little bit of absolute decoupling, they're not any, even those countries are not anywhere near where they would need to be to stay within the Paris Agreement. Okay, and we are talking about the Netherlands, Sweden, and the UK. I think the UK is the biggest country there, but it's like the Netherlands. Listen, I was born in the Netherlands. Okay, it's a fine country, but it's very tiny. Like the fact that you decoupled, even if it was sufficient, which it isn't,
Yeah.
like it's irrelevant.
It is interesting though, because I think with IKEA's report, they showed that I want to say increased. Okay, so they did prove that you can grow while lowering your carbon emissions. I'm trying to remember what percentage. I want to say like 12%, but it was because they decreased their production volume or something and increased sales.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with this report, so I can't go into the details.
Yeah.
I think one of the key things that you see in sustainability circles and where people are starting to say, where people are also starting to catch on, it's like, okay, so you had a reduction. Is it
Yeah.
enough? Are you meeting your
Yeah.
targets? Are you anywhere near net zero? And
Yeah.
that's really what people now are starting to say with the planetary boundaries and with regenerative business models in general. They say,
Yeah.
what does that mean? And it means that you internalize planetary boundaries in your city, in your state,
Hmm.
or in your company. So you know what I mean? And that's also what I
Yeah.
have, for example, with ESG finance. That's all relative. You're just looking for the companies that are least bad, typically with ESG,
Yeah.
because it's a relative benchmarking. But what we need is that you measure it towards what would be within your fair share of Earth's carrying capacity. And I don't see
Yeah.
that happening. I don't know if they did that in the IKEA report, but from what you're telling me, it sounds like they didn't.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm not sure. I wrote about this in my Substack. I do think that was the only company that I saw where they were actually able to do that because all the other reports that I'm looking at are tech companies. Maybe we can talk a little bit about technology and the role in this shift.
Yeah, and I should say about IKEA, I do know that IKEA is owned by a foundation, and in that sense, it's a not for profit. So it's one of the biggest not for profits out there. So I don't want to bash IKEA necessarily. So if it's totally possible to be a very big company, for example, and still put a social purpose strictly above profit, because that's what's happening in IKEA. All their profit is not accumulated by some owner; it goes to a foundation, which supports the ultimate goal of that foundation is to improve maternal health. So
Oh, interesting.
yeah,
I did not know that.
yeah,
But I do know that IKEA does care a lot about sustainability. We're actually doing a sustainability design event with them next month.
yeah.
And they have a sustainability team and like, just interacting with them, you know that they definitely prioritize sustainability.
Yeah, and I do think it's a good example of a company that doesn't necessarily puts profit growth at its ultimate goal, but it clearly grew. So again, I think it's very important sometimes to reiterate that saying that we should let go of growth or growth shouldn't be the ultimate purpose doesn't mean you're anti-growth.
Right. It's just decentering it.
Right.
Okay, so since a lot of people listening to this podcast will be either product designers or at least technologists, can you talk to us a little bit about the role that technology plays in this shift?
Technology is, of course, absolutely crucial to making this shift because it can give us a lot of more efficiencies and therefore reduce our ecological footprint. The thing that I have with technology right now, what I have with techno-optimists, is that just technology is enough and we don't have to change the system. And this is clearly wrong, again, because of the data out there. You just don't see it happening. We don't see decoupling. We definitely see no reductions in biodiversity impacts or water use or that sort of thing. But I also think from a theory perspective, it's not that hard to understand if you think about it, because technology is a tool. So it's part of the system. So as this tool, technology is ultimately going to serve that purpose of the goal it's part of. And so technology will serve growth as long as that's the ultimate goal. And that's exactly what you see. Renewable energy is a great example, right? We talked about fossil fuel energy, and then people are like, yeah, no, but we're shifting to renewable energy. We have seen so many more installations, and that's true. We've seen a lot more wind and solar. And guess what? Fossil fuel use is still at an all-time high. How is that possible? Why is that possible? Because we live in a growth economy, and so it's been added on top of the fossil fuel use instead of replacing it.
I saw that chart recently. I can't remember where, and it showed that actually the fossil fuel line was pretty steady. And I was like, huh? It doesn't make sense when our renewable energy consumption is growing so much.
So much exponential increase.
Yeah.
But that's what I mean. That's what you get in a growth-based system.
Yeah, I really like the example you gave that technology is a tool, and ultimately it's just going to reflect the humans that are in charge of the tool, right?
Exactly.
And if our economy is currently centered on GDP or, growth, then we're going to see that reflected. Like with Google and Microsoft and all of these reports that came out recently, there's a huge AI boom. Everyone's talking about AI, but I so rarely see people talking about the environmental impact of AI.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that these companies, Microsoft and Google, both reported an increase year over year, and from their baseline because of AI. Like they cited that it was the data centers.
Yes, yeah, and that's what's called the rebound effect. You see this with a lot of new
Yeah.
technologies, that it does offer hope for less impact. It does, and then oftentimes you see that it does a little bit in the short term, and then it spurs all these new innovations to make more money that just completely does that original impact and or reduction, and just you end up consuming ever more.
And I think it's important to acknowledge, like, when, for example, well, I think it's safe to assume that you're not a techno-optimist. So
No. We have to do it ourselves. Sorry. We have to be the adult here and do it ourselves.
I think I like the word techno-intentionalist, because a lot of people listening who are really techno-optimists or maybe just, pro-tech will assume, oh, well, then you're anti, and that's also not the case.
No. Yeah, I love
Right?
that
Like,
word too, actually, techno-intentionalist. Yeah, and I think I started my answer with that. Of course, it's a crucial part of the solution. Of course. But it's not going to save us. It's not our savior. It's going to be an absolutely crucial tool once we aim it at the right goal.
So when people are looking at this like planned decline in growth that, you show in your chart, what does that look like, and how is that not an economic recession?
Yeah, great question. And I want to acknowledge the fear behind that, because what happens in this economic system, even for the winners, like you and I, arguably, because we have our basic needs met, at least. We have a system where if you don't have enough money, your basic needs just go unmet. And I think that's very key to remember. That's design choice of the system. And I think it's a very harsh and unnatural choice. But this system then is based on growth, so it has to grow, right? That's the imperative. So if then you don't have growth, obviously the system is going to falter and people's needs go unmet. So it's very understandable that people feel this fragility all the time. I think the trauma, the collective trauma of that is also something that's not well understood. That I'm started to read psychologists' books now about trauma, because I think there's so much collective trauma in this society of having been told that we're selfish, that we're sociopaths, basically, and we don't care about what happens to other people.
Your mom doesn't tell you that? No, I'm
kidding. and that these people, you run in the street, you walk in the street, you see a homeless person, and you turn the other way because it's a systemic issue that you can't solve right there and then. But that feels unnatural to us, right? Because it's not in our nature. actually.
I think to your point, there's also a lot of collective trauma around money.
And what do you mean with that?
So many people maybe grew up in situations where they either really didn't have money or they were struggling, or maybe their parents told them that we don't have money, or you need to choose between soccer, for example, and getting braces. These kind of situations where people like you and me, for example, or people in our circles have enough money to live. But still, for everyone, I think there is this need for more.
More.
I
Yeah.
need more money. Now I have my basic needs. Now I need a rainy day fund. Now I have a rainy day fund. Now I need to save for retirement. I need more for retirement. I need more for my 401k. So it's like there's this endless chase for money.
That's exactly what I was talking about. I completely agree. I
Yeah.
think that this never enough thing, I think
Yeah.
for some people, I think we all feel that to some extent, and for certain
Yeah.
people more than others. And I think that's also why some of the people that sometimes defend this the hardest are the people who grew up poor and now are not poor anymore, because they were like, no, this will never happen to me again. And so they've really embraced that very harsh thinking that underlies this system. They're like, this will never happen to me again. And they like you said, they can never have enough, even though they clearly have more money at some point than they could ever spend. You see this a lot in the US with certain billionaires, and they just keep going. And I think I completely agree. I think I would say that's a mental illness. I think this requires therapy, and I think it stems from that trauma that you talked about.
Definitely a type of trauma. And I think most people probably have to work through that. Like I definitely had, unfortunately, I'm not a billionaire, surprise, but I definitely had this attitude that you're talking about where I grew up struggling. And then, once I got that salary, I was always still pursuing more, more, more. Now I need to save, now I need to invest. And I think I just came to a point where actually I realized like, oh, it's never going to be enough. But then I'm on a hamster wheel. And what for? Why am I not enjoying my life?
That's the thing, and that's what most of us feel. I also think that's why we see a lot of increased popularity in these post-growth economics and well-being economics frameworks, especially in Europe, where people like, I feel like I'm being on a hamster wheel. There's got to be something better than this. There just got to be. And there is, I think. And if you look back in history, most of our economic systems were not designed around growth. I think it's very important to realize we had markets, we had people specializing in certain jobs. Okay, all of that we had going on. We had trade long before we had this growth imperative. I think that's very important to realize.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm getting old or what, but I find it very helpful now to look at history before I was born, you know?
Yes,
So
I
it's
have
like
that
really
too.
looking way
I
back.
have that too. When I was younger, I was like, "That's in the past. Why would I be
Yeah.
interested in that?" And then, no, yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. Actually,
Yeah.
turns out. But yeah, so to answer your question, that's what we all know what a recession is, and the fear for that is very, very valid because it goes to your basic needs, and we all have
Hmm.
that. So that's very understandable. That's also why politicians are so sensitive around this because they fear social unrest. So
Yeah.
but it is important to note that, like, the absence of growth in a system that needs growth, that is going to be it's going to have a very different impact than the absence of growth in a system that doesn't need it, that's
Yeah.
indifferent to it.
Hmm.
Remember, in a well-being economy, people's needs are met by design. So
Yeah.
whether or not we have growth, people's needs are going to be met. So it's almost the opposite, really.
Right. In the TED Talk, you're talking a lot about, I guess, a system or systems change. And I'm curious how this could apply for design.
I think this is important maybe to, if you talk about design, I think this is important to mention as well. A lot of times when I have this discussion, people are like, well, we have to redesign our entire economy. It sounds like a lot of work. And I'm like, yeah, but we're going to have a lot of work anyway. Okay, it's going
Yeah.
to be a bumpy ride because dealing with the aftermath of ecosystem breakdown is also a lot of effort. So,
Yeah.
you know, so
We're trying to survive on a planet that
right.
cannot
So
support you
it's like,
anymore.
yeah, I also listen, I'm lazy too, but this is just the way it is, man. Because and I think that's important to realize, business as usual. Continuing that is often when I talk about let's change the system, the response is like as if continuing business as usual is an option. And
Yeah.
it is an absolute
It's not.
impossibility. So
Yeah.
we're gonna change one way or another. So that's the thing. Either the end of growth comes by disaster or by design. And I would argue for the design option because it's a lot better for human and ecological well-being.
I like this example that you gave in the TED Talk where you were talking about bees, I think. There was some sort of like technological solution for bees that maybe if you remember you can share.
Of course, yeah. And I think, yeah, that's the other thing where they're like, well, we don't have to change because we have the technology. And I think that goes to who we are and what we really desire. And I'm like, okay, well, let's say you're right. It's nowhere in the data, but okay, sure. Nobody really knows the future for sure. Maybe we're just 1 week away from finally inventing a nuclear fusion or something. Not that that's going to solve everything either. But let's say, why would we, let's say we could reinvent robot pollinators to replace the dying bee colonies. Why would we choose that if we can also redesign our agricultural system towards regenerative agriculture, right? Why would we invent drones to replant trees? Well, we can also redesign our economic system so that existing forest isn't cut down. And I think that really goes to we would want to make this change anyway, even if we were not facing ecosystem collapse, because it's just a much better much better place for us to live.
Yeah, I really like that point because something I've been thinking about lately is like, even if it wasn't for climate change, let's say we didn't have a climate change problem, wouldn't you still want to take care of your home and your environment that you're in? You know,
Right.
like I see, I'm in Amsterdam for people that don't know, that people are just like throwing a lot of trash in the streets and whatever. And I'm like, it makes me so sad that people would, just like throw their trash on the ground. Like you're living in the city, don't you want to take care of it? And I think it's that sort of attitude. Like, why don't you just intrinsically want to take care of the planet anyways?
And I do think most people want to. So you're right. So we've been told that we don't care. Those are externalities. That's not my problem. And some people have internalized that. And also, a minority of the population is genuinely, their makeup is just genuinely that of a sociopath. And they truly do not care and never will. But the majority of people are really quite altruistic. I like how George Monbiot put it. He said, we're a society of altruists governed by sociopaths.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen the diffusions of innovation where it shows, like innovators, early adopters, early majority. And actually, that shows that you only need 16% of the population to lead to start causing the rest of society to follow. So when we talk about climate change or, all of this, for example, shifting the economy, I think a lot of people disengage because they feel powerless and they feel like, well, I don't think I can do anything to help that. So I'm just gonna not look at it. Sort of like when you see a homeless person and you're like, oh, I can't do anything, so I'm just not gonna make eye contact. It's that sort of attitude. And I think actually everyone has a role to play in that.
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up because I think that I typically end a presentation with that as well, or I get a question at the end about it. Social tipping points is what you're talking about. We talked about Earth systems tipping points, climate tipping points, but there are also social tipping points, and it's about 16 to 20%. So it's about 1/5 of the population. So I think that's very important to remember when you talk about this new narrative, because that's how we change the system. How do we change the system? Not with technology. That's not where you start. You start with the narrative that's underlying that entire system. And then when you talk about this new narrative and you replace the goal of the system, the whole thing starts to change differently. But how do you get there? Well, you build out this new narrative wherever you are in the system. That's the great thing about the system. You don't have control, but you do have influence wherever you are, as long as you're part of it. And so you talk about that new narrative with your coworkers or with your family or at school or whatever. And then you contribute to that 20%. And you do not worry about the majority, because the majority does not have to come along at that point. Only when you reach that tipping point does the majority come along.
Yeah, I think it's also reassuring in a way because then okay, I'm only going to focus on myself and I don't have to care about what everyone else is doing? I think that's where a lot of people can feel really frustrated is the desire to control other people.
Right. And then it's very frustrating because then if you need to control the system, that means you have to have at least reached the majority and everything, and that will never happen because it's way too big. But you don't have to do that. You can just focus on your own circle, and just it's frustrating because you don't have control, but at the other hand, it is very reassuring because you're not working alone. You're always connected to other people doing their part in the system.
Do you have any practical tips that you could share with people who are in technology?
In technology, really, my advice is always the same when it comes to this, and that's learn the new narrative. And that starts with yourself, by the way. So that's very interesting because we're talking about this big system.
Yeah.
And almost paradoxical. It's not really a paradox, but it is a little bit counterintuitive at first, where you go, how personal it is. Because if you want to build out this new narrative into the system, you have to start by changing it in yourself. And I'm sorry because it sounds so corny, but it is true. Because you have internalized those stories too.
Yeah.
And like we just discussed. And so it really starts with constantly, and that's not like you do it and now it's done. That's a constant journey you're on to decapitalize, like get rid of this internalized capitalism that you always have to be productive. You always have to grow and build. And sometimes when you do that, it's fine. And sometimes, you just stare out the window and look at a squirrel. And that's very good too. So it starts there, very personal, but it can't stay there. And then you build it out. But that is unfortunate. I mean, well, I don't know. That's just the way it is. I don't know if it's unfortunate, but sometimes people ask me for advice, and I'm like, it's so unique to you. So it starts with your personal journey, and then you have to find where you can exert that influence.
And do you think this future economic model is still some form of capitalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, this has been a journey for me too. When I wrote my book, 5 Insights for Avoiding Global Collapse, and that came out in 2022, so 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. And it's free for download, by the way, online. So that's only 2 years ago. But when I wrote this, it's more than 2 years ago. I wrote, I'm not sure, but I think it could still happen with a new version of capitalism. And since then, I stand by most of what I said in my book, but since then, I am sure that it will never happen in capitalism. So I have had some rolling insight there. I just don't think. And again, we can have all these theories, but at this point in history, I think the best argument is if it was going to happen under capitalism, it would have happened by now.
And I also think like there is something to maybe not getting too fixed into the terminology because it can be really triggering to people somehow. At least that's what I observe. But it's more like, let's do the actions and then what happens from that happens, but we're moving towards the goal, and we can we don't need to obsess about the naming conventions of whatever that is,
I agree. I think it's important. Another thing there is degrowth, for example. A lot of people get very nervous, so I use it very selectively. I talk about degrowth in my TED talk. It's all of it is degrowth, but I don't use the word. So I do tailor it to my audience. But I will say, if we're talking about this personal journey and kind of thing, if you feel a hesitance, which I completely understand because I had it too. I still have it sometimes. Maybe just be curious as to why that is. Why is it that is triggering for you? What's so personal about that system?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I don't know if you saw, but on the podcast, I have an episode where I talk about I critique capitalism, basically. I don't say capitalism is entirely bad, but I'm just talking about, certain critiques on capitalism. And someone gave me 1 star, and it must have really triggered them. And I also posted some of these clips on social media, and people were like, wow, that sounds like Marxism. And so I think there's just a lot of a strong collective reaction to the word capitalism.
Yeah, and I think that's been drilled into us when I became a US citizen. So I'm a dual citizen. Yeah. One of the questions
congratulations.
was...
That's lucky.
Yeah. I became a citizen under the Trump administration. I've never felt particularly proud, but I will say if Harris wins, I think you might have gathered that I'm not a Trump supporter.
No?
I know, it's shocking. I think that would be the first time where I would be actually positively proud to be an American.
Yeah.
But we'll see if that happens. That's entirely unsure. But she's got a good chance. But yeah, and I think it is triggering also. And I had that too. When I was asked, when one of the things that I had to fill out before becoming naturalized in the US was, have you ever joined a communist party, or do you ever plan to? Like, of all the things you could ask me, like a pedophile ring or something, this is what they were asking me, you know? So I think that's they didn't ask me, are you ever going to be planning to sell a cocaine or something? Like, so I think it's very telling how deep that is in there. And that goes to power structures that I think is very deeply in us. And that's sometimes when I say to people when they're like, but we need growth. And I'm like, well, we don't need growth to satisfy everybody's needs. But we do need constant growth if we have any hope of satisfying anybody's needs without the rich sharing more of what they already have. So the next time you have this knee-jerk reaction, maybe ask yourself, who's benefiting from this story?
Yeah, I think that's a really good message for people to question things more and their own thought process.
Yeah, but I want to be empathetic and not judgmental, because it's my own journey, and only 2 years ago I was like, I'm sure we can still do it within capitalism, you know, because I'm from the Netherlands, they come up with it. Now I'm in the US, they really turbocharged it, so it's all I've ever known. And I know a lot of nice people here. The Netherlands was freed from the Nazis by these capitalists, you know. So my grandfather was in the Nazi camps towards the end of the war, and he actually survived because he was only captured at the end. And so he was unsurprised, and then we were freed by the Allied forces, of course. And I still remember, and this is a memory that only resurfaced over the past 2 years, really, where we would have dinner, and then my father would say something what he perceived as critical of capitalism. And he would say, hey, those filthy capitalists are the only reason we're not speaking German right now. And that shut down the discussion. And I think I was thinking maybe that's why there was such a blockage for me to talk about, to re-examine that and go, is this really the only system that could work for us? And I think we all have this kind of experiences.
Yeah, to your point, I think it's helpful to look at things that have happened in the past before we were alive, because the timeline is so much longer. And actually, it would be abnormal for us to just stay the same, you know? It's constantly shifting.
Yes, and I think, and that also illustrates what a personal journey this is, if you really want this system's change.
Okay, so for the lightning round, I'm just gonna go through several questions, and then, yeah, you can just give like a quick answer. If you want to elaborate, you're welcome to. So first question, who do you admire in life or business?
There are a lot of thinkers right now, I think, that I really admire. I like the work of Rihanna Eisler a lot, because she talks about these narratives on a very deep level. Lately, I'm very impressed with Kamala Harris. I think her story is quite unique, and her scent and everything.
Yeah.
So, but oh God, there's so many. There's so many.
How do you define success?
I define success as being happy, but I mean fully alive, not, you know, consistently happy. That I have thought about a lot. And I think in society, we undervalue happiness. Just being happy with what you have and really taking it in, and all this mindfulness and all that stuff. I sometimes see people still, they look at me and they don't know what to do with me, because I will stand at the sea and just really take it in. And then, you know, I've sometimes seen people look at me like, what is she doing? And I think it's very telling of our society that we're like, she's not doing anything. That's weird. Well, it's very clear I'm just enjoying the ocean. And we do other things where you're allowed to just watch it, right? But apparently it can't be just the ocean or something like that, or a flower. And I do think that happiness lies in those kind of things. And I see a lot of people I've been quite surprised at how people define success in other ways, like a lot of money or high status. I've seen people give up so much, their health, their relationships, their integrity, their reputation, just for what they perceived as high status or a lot of money. And I just look at that and I'm like, I think you kind of failed as a human being, man. Again, I think a lot of time just simply being happy is seen as a simple person's doing. And I
Right.
think, first of all, there's a lot of thought that goes behind this, and there's a lot of preparation. You can't really be happy if you're not eating well or sleeping enough, etc. But also, I think, yeah, it's very telling that this is not valued at all. Well, actually, I do think it's
Right.
actually, in a way, it's fun work, but it is a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, you have to invest in yourself.
Yes, and it's also it is an act of defiance. It's not just
Mhm.
something you do for yourself. Like, no, it's a lot of work, and now I'm happy. So I think I think it's a defiance to the
Yeah.
system.
Yeah, I do agree because I think that if you don't invest in yourself and you don't love yourself, then you're going to be searching for things outside of yourself to fulfill the needs, you know. I
Yeah,
almost said artificial, but like it's still a real need to you if you feel that way, you know?
but it's a great way to keep a growth-based system going. I talk about that in my book too. Like, that's why it's so different, because if we would meet our needs once they're satisfied, but in a growth-based system, you need those needs unmet permanently. Your social needs, most of the time in the West, is our social needs, and that's what capitalism does. It commodifies nature, obviously, but also our bodies as well. I think in the medical industry, it's quite clear to me, especially in the US as well. But also our inner world, our social interactions are made into commodities.
Yeah, and not to get too off topic, but like I see so many videos now on social media where it's like marketing to women about how they look, you
Oh
know?
yeah,
Oh, you need this, you need that, you need Botox, you
that,
need surgery, like, and
think
I'm
about
like,
what would happen to all those industries if women just decided, you know what, I'm good enough as I am.
yeah, yeah,
That,
exactly.
wow, we would see, yeah, and I think we will see a real dip in GDP, but I think as a society we
Yeah,
would be
women are
much
keeping the
happier.
economy going.
Yeah. Right, so I think that's why just being happy with who you are, and being happy in general is,
Yeah,
and really I think it's a sign of strength.
yeah, absolutely. Favorite self-development practice?
Oh, good question. My favorite one, yeah, obviously I have a lot. So I have the general stuff of like walking in nature, doing yoga, and all that stuff. Honestly, my one of my favorites is the ones that I just mentioned. Like, I will work, because there is a lot of value in that too, right? Because I talked about, you don't always have to be productive, but if you're sometimes productive, that flow gives a lot of satisfaction too, if you feel like your work actually have purpose. But then I take a take a step back and I stare out the window for a while, just staring at a bird or a squirrel, and that just takes 5 minutes. But it's really nice to just get back in my body and back into the world. So that's one of my favorite ones, actually,
Oh yeah, and it's nice because it's so simple for people to do.
because it's so simple. You can't
Yeah.
sell it. You can't commoditize it, and the squirrels are like so in their body.
So funny.
Yeah,
I've never stared at a squirrel. Well, actually, at UC Berkeley's campus, there are squirrels everywhere.
yeah, and they're like, they have character, man. They will see me look, and they're like, I don't care. I'm doing my own thing. And sometimes they'll defy me. They go up in the tree and then they'll shake their tail, and they're like, you can't get me. And like, you're right. I'm not gonna try. But they have character. Yeah.
That's so funny. Yeah, I mean, I have a dog sleeping behind me. I don't know if you can see
I
him.
have
So,
was looking, and that was super cute. Yeah.
yeah, he's a teckle. But yeah, sometimes I just look at him and I feel my dopamine rise, you know? Like they say dogs like lower your blood pressure and everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a very
Yeah.
good point. In general, what I do is I do things that give me serotonin and oxytocin. Those are the things that you want. So the dopamine one is, and I think actually that's probably what you meant. So we know that we have the happiness hormones and the pleasure hormones, and dopamine one is more of a pleasure hormone, which is makes you feel nice. So it's good. There's nothing wrong with it, but it does last longer. So it makes it more easy to commoditize, actually. So scrolling on your phone and clicking an article releases dopamine, not oxytocin. So another way, actually, thank you for that trigger, because that's actually what I do. I try whatever activity it is. I try to make it ones that science tells me releases more oxytocin and serotonin.
Yeah, that's a good point actually, because you actually want to do a dopamine detox, especially I think for people alive now. It's like with all the social media and the hits that you're getting and the notifications, like I turn off all of my notifications.
Yeah, I think we all know the saying that, the best way to not be happy is to constantly be chasing happiness. So I think that is a good point. Like, and but I don't think then what you should do is not chase happiness. But I
Yeah.
understand why that is said, because you get this hedonistic thing, which is also very destructive. But that's the kind of dopamine chasing that you see a lot in society. I agree, because you can capitalize easier on that. So really, what you want to do is do the more of the oxytocin thing, and that's typically things that are done with somebody else. So let's say you go for a walk in the park with your loved one, you enjoy nature, that releases a lot of oxytocin. That's the kind of thing that you want to be doing.
Okay, what's some feedback you've gotten from colleagues that has changed your perspective on yourself?
Yeah, it's hard to choose, because there are definitely constantly these little feedbacks that I take on, but there's nothing that particularly stands out. I do constantly have this feedback from people, and I ask for it. Yeah, and I think I like that practice at work, where you just constantly get little feedback from your colleagues instead of this whole feedback session you have with your manager. I'm so happy we don't do that, because those are really, they're quite dispiriting, aren't they? And they're not that useful. But I'm a firm believer of this constant feedback. So yeah, I'm sorry, there's not one thing that stands out, because I try to elicit as much feedback as possible, just on a
Mm.
constant basis.
Yeah, I think that's a really good attitude to have too. And then you're never shocked if you do receive something in a more formal setting.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you just get feedback that you don't think is that useful. So you do have to do you have to be resilient in that way, where you choose to take that on board or not. But in general, I think overall it's super helpful.
And okay, last question. What makes you proud of who you are today?
I think that my my sensitivity with the world, and what's going on with the world. Sorry for
Yeah.
putting it like that. It had me down quite a bit when I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy that I was able to not make myself less sensitive. Some people do that; they go numb to survive,
Yeah.
and they have to. And I feel very lucky that I was privileged enough, but also smart enough to not let that happen and go, you know
Yeah.
what? I'm just gonna let that disappointment and pain feel. I'm gonna let myself feel that, and over time, in my late 30s and 40s, I really started to be able to make that into something where I feel that I do actually create the world, add value to the world.
I think that's really tricky because a lot of people can be more sensitive. And then it's like, how do you navigate getting to a point where you can be yourself and be sensitive, but still exist in a world which can sometimes be quite harsh, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this
Yeah.
sensitivity is typically, it's also undervalued in our society, but
Yeah.
it's a very beautiful trait to have. And a good amount of people, I'm not sure how many, but I think double digits for sure. So at least 11% of
Yeah.
people are actually highly sensitive, as it's called. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of recent studies in that, what the usefulness of these hypersensitive people, not hypersensitive, but highly sensitive people, is
Yeah.
to the overall society, because they think things through very deeply. They feel it very deeply, and it
Hmm.
makes them vulnerable. But it
Yeah.
also makes them add some really valuable insights to a group sometimes.
Yeah, I like that. What's advice you would give to someone, like if you could give advice to yourself in your 20s dealing with that?
Yeah, and very similar to
Yeah.
what I just said. Is like, don't let you know, feeling pain is not a defeat,
Yeah.
and caring and being disappointed in that is not, you're allowed to grieve, and
Yeah.
really feel that, and
Yeah.
find the wisdom at the end of that.
Yeah. I like that. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This was such a great conversation, so insightful, and I'm gonna go back and listen to it too, actually, because I feel like I need to take that in a second time. But yeah, thank you so much for joining.
It was my pleasure. It was very nice talking to you. Thank you.
Awesome.